There is a small wooden box in almost every Catholic church on earth. No cameras, no microphones, no witnesses. And yet, inside that box, more secrets have been spoken: murders, betrayals, addictions, affairs, decades of guilt, than in any courtroom, any therapist's office, any prison confession in human history. And here's what will shock you. The priest sitting on the other side of that screen is bound by a law so absolute, so unbreakable, that men have been tortured, exiled, and even killed rather than break it. Not soldiers, not spies, priests, or ordinary parish priests who chose death over repeating a single sentence they heard in that box. But that's only the beginning. What actually happens when a person walks into that room is stranger and more psychologically radical than most people, Catholic or not, ever realize. It's not just telling your sins. There is a mechanism at work there that neuroscientists, psychologists, and addiction specialists are only now starting to take seriously. Something about naming your worst moment out loud to another human being, shared in a structured ritual of accountability that appears to do something to the human mind that self-help books and journaling simply cannot replicate. In the next few minutes, we're going to walk through 6 things about confession that will change the way you see this ancient practice forever. From its violent, secretive history to the one sin priests say they hear more than any other, to the untold stories of priests who paid with their lives to protect what you told them. Most people assume the confessional box, that small wooden structure with a screen or grill separating priest and penitent, has been part of Catholic life since the time of the apostles. It hasn't. And the real story of how it came to exist is far stranger and far darker than most churchgoers realize. In the earliest centuries of Christianity, confession of sins was often public. If you had committed a serious sin, apostasy, murder, adultery, you didn't whisper it behind a screen. You stood before the entire congregation, sometimes for years, in visible penance, sackcloth, ashes, exclusion from the sacraments, public fasting, witnessed by your neighbors. It was humiliating by design. The community needed to see your sorrow before it would accept your return. This system worked in a brutal sort of way in small, tight-knit communities. But it had a devastating side effect. People stopped confessing. Faced with public shame that could follow them the rest of their lives, many Christians simply waited until their deathbed to confess anything at all, gambling that a single last-minute confession would be enough to save them while living decades in unconfessed sin. Bishops watched their communities spiritually collapse under the weight of a system too harsh to actually use. It was Irish monks, of all people, working in isolated monasteries around the 6th and 7th centuries, who quietly began doing something radical, hearing confessions privately, one-on-one, and assigning private penances instead of public humiliation. They kept handwritten manuals called penitentials that listed sins alongside suggested penances, almost like a private rule book for the confessional. This was controversial. Many bishops on the European continent initially resisted it, arguing it was too easy, too secretive, a betrayal of the ancient public model. But it worked. People actually started confessing again because they weren't terrified of public exposure. Private confession spread from Ireland into Britain, then across Europe, until by the early Middle Ages, it had effectively replaced the old public system almost everywhere. Then came the physical box itself, and this part surprises almost everyone. The enclosed confessional booth, as we recognize it today, wasn't invented until the 1500s, largely credited to a churchman in Milan during the Counter-Reformation. Why then? Because the church was responding to a real documented crisis. Private, one-on-one confession in open rooms or sacristies had, in numerous well-recorded cases, become an opportunity for predatory clergy to manipulate or abuse penitents, particularly women, under the cover of spiritual direction. The physical screen, the grill separating priest and penitent, was introduced specifically as a protective barrier to prevent exactly this kind of abuse and to formalize distance and anonymity as a safeguard. That single design choice, a wooden screen meant to protect the vulnerable, became the architectural symbol most people now associate with mystery, secrecy, even shame. In reality, its origin was closer to a safety reform than a spiritual one. And then there is the part of this history that sounds almost unbelievable, the seal of confession, the absolute rule that a priest can never, under any circumstances, for any reason, reveal what he hears in confession, was tested by governments, kings, and even torturers for centuries, and it held. The most famous case is St. John of Nepomuc, a 14th century priest in Bohemia. According to the traditional account, the king demanded to know what the queen had confessed, suspecting infidelity. The priest refused. He was tortured, and according to the traditional narrative, ultimately drowned in the Vltava River rather than break the seal. Whether every detail of that particular medieval account is historically airtight is debated by scholars. But what is not debated is that it became the founding legend for an idea the church has enforced with total consistency ever since. This rule has no exceptions. Not for murder confessions, not for court subpoenas, not for terrorism, not even in official church teaching if the priest's own life is threatened for refusing to talk. A priest who breaks the seal faces automatic excommunication, one of the most severe penalties in all of canon law, reserved for only the gravest offenses. Modern legal systems have repeatedly collided with this rule. In numerous countries, courts have attempted to compel priests to testify about what they heard in confession, particularly in abuse investigations. In case after case, priests have refused, some accepting jail time rather than comply. Legislators in several nations have proposed laws explicitly overriding the seal of confession in cases involving crimes against children, arguing no confidentiality should protect predators. The church's canonical answer has remained unmoved. The seal is treated as inviolable, a rule the priest himself has no authority to waive, even with the penitent's permission, even to save his own life or reputation. This is worth sitting with for a moment. In an age where almost every institution, governments, corporations, even therapists under certain legal conditions can be compelled to disclose information, this one room remains by design absolutely sealed. That single fact reframes everything about what happens when someone walks through that door. It is not a casual conversation. It is arguably the most protected communication that exists anywhere in human society, most non-Catholics. And honestly, many Catholics picture confession as something close to a transaction. You list your sins, the priest says some words, you say a prayer, you leave. Mechanical, almost bureaucratic. That is not what priests who hear confessions regularly describe, and it is not what the structure of the sacrament is actually designed to do. The formal structure has 4 parts, and each one is doing distinct psychological and spiritual work that most people never stop to notice. First, the examination of conscience. Before a person ever enters the confessional, they are supposed to have spent real time, sometimes with a printed guide, sometimes just alone, going back through their recent life and naming specifically where they failed, not vague guilt, specific moments. This step alone is unusual in modern life. Almost nowhere else are adults asked to sit down on a regular, recurring basis and conduct a structured, honest audit of their own behavior toward others. Psychologists who study habit and behavior change have long noted that vague guilt is almost useless for changing behavior, while specific, named acknowledgement of a specific action is one of the few things that reliably precedes real change. Second, confession itself. Sins spoken out loud to another person. This is the part most outsiders focus on, but the detail that gets missed is why it has to be spoken, not just thought or written. There is a well-documented phenomenon in psychology, sometimes described as the difference between private rumination and interpersonal disclosure. Simply thinking about a wrongdoing tends to loop, the same shame replaying without resolution. But research on confiding in another person, independent of any religious context at all, has repeatedly shown that verbalizing a transgression to another human being, especially one who does not react with disgust or rejection, measurably reduces the physiological stress response associated with guilt. Confession structurally forces exactly this, not silent guilt, not a private journal entry, but a spoken admission to a real person sitting a few feet away who has heard version after version of very similar sins for years and does not flinch. Third, the penance and absolution. The priest assigns a small act, prayers, sometimes a concrete action like an apology or restitution, and then says the words of absolution, a formal declaration that within Catholic theological understanding, the sin is truly forgiven, not symbolically, not kind of, but actually and completely. This is the part that separates confession from talk therapy or venting to a friend. A therapist, however skilled, is not making a claim about the metaphysical state of your soul. A friend, however kind, cannot tell you with any authority that your guilt is now factually over. The sacrament claims to do exactly that, to close the account completely, not just to help you feel better about it. Fourth, and this is the part almost nobody discusses, the priest is never permitted to treat the sin as still existing after absolution. Canonically, the priest is taught to regard what was confessed as, in effect, erased from his own relationship with the penitent. He cannot bring it up later, cannot treat the person differently because of it, cannot let it color a future interaction, even privately in his own mind, insofar as he is able to control that. Priests describe this as one of the strangest and most demanding parts of the role. Hearing something horrifying, sometimes the worst thing a person has ever done, and then being required, not just etiquette, but under actual spiritual obligation, to greet that same person warmly the following week, as though the account were, in the truest sense, already closed. There is also a detail about anonymity that surprises people who assume every confession happens behind a screen with strangers. In smaller parishes, particularly in rural areas, penitents frequently confess face-to-face to a priest who knows them personally, their neighbor, sometimes even a family friend. The screen is optional in the modern rite. Many Catholics now choose face-to-face confession specifically because they find it more personal, not less. What makes this psychologically remarkable is that people will say things face-to-face to a known, named human being that they would never say to their own spouse, their own doctor, or their own therapist, specifically because the seal guarantees, with total legal and theological force, that it goes nowhere. Confidentiality, this absolute, is genuinely rare in human relationships, and its rarity is precisely what makes people willing to say the unsayable inside that room. Priests who have heard confessions for decades across parish assignments, hospital chaplaincies, prison ministries, describe a common pattern. The sins people are most terrified to say out loud are almost never the ones an outside observer would guess. It's rarely the big, dramatic sins people fear will shock the priest. Far more often, it's the small, repeated failures, a specific unkindness to a parent, a particular lie sustained over years, an ongoing resentment that people find hardest to actually name out loud, because naming them requires admitting specifically and without excuse, I did this, and I knew it was wrong while I was doing it. If you ask the average person to guess what fills a priest's day in the confessional, most would guess something dramatic: infidelity, violence, theft, addiction. Those confessions do happen. But priests who have spent decades hearing confessions, when they speak publicly about patterns without ever, of course, describing any specific individual's confession, which would itself violate the seal consistently describe something that a person might reasonably doubt, especially given how notoriously unreliable human self-assessment of guilt and forgiveness can be. The theological argument is that an internal sense of, I think God forgave me, is vulnerable to both false comfort and false doubt, while hearing an external, authorized declaration of absolution addresses a specifically human need for something concrete to anchor an abstract spiritual claim. Reasonable people, including many Christians outside the Catholic tradition, disagree with this reasoning and hold that no human intermediary is needed for forgiveness. That disagreement is a genuine, long-standing point of theological division, not a misunderstanding to be corrected. Misconception 4. If I've been away for a long time, years, even decades, the priest will react badly or make me feel worse about how long it's been. Priests who work specifically in this ministry describe the opposite as far more typical. Relief and warmth, not irritation. When someone returns after a long absence, precisely because the entire theological framework treats this as the central purpose of the sacrament, a way back, not a gate that gets harder to open the longer someone stays away. Individual pastoral experiences do vary, and it would be inaccurate to claim every priest handles this ideally in every instance, but the formal spiritual training explicitly warns against exactly the harshness people fear, precisely because it is recognized as the single biggest deterrent keeping people away. Misconception 5. Confessing the same sin repeatedly means I'm not really sorry, or the sacrament isn't working. As covered earlier, this is one of the most persistent fears, and it inverts what confessors actually observe. Repeated confession of the same struggle over years is treated as the normal, expected texture of real moral effort, not evidence of insincerity, provided the person is genuinely trying, however imperfectly, rather than confessing with no intention of change at all. Taken together, these misconceptions share a common thread. They all assume the confessional is a room designed to catch people in failure and make them feel it more acutely. The actual design, historically, psychologically, and theologically, is closer to the opposite. A room built quite deliberately around a single tightly guarded promise of total confidentiality, specifically so that a person can, for a few minutes, stop performing, stop managing anyone's reaction, and simply say the true thing out loud. Which leaves one final question, the one this entire subject ultimately points toward. Strip away the incense, the Latin, the centuries of ritual, and what confession is actually built around is something startlingly modern in its relevance. A structured, repeatable practice for verbal, specific, accountable disclosure of wrongdoing to another human being, protected by absolute confidentiality, followed by a formal external declaration that the matter is closed. It's worth noticing how much of contemporary life has quietly reconstructed pieces of this same structure without any religious framing at all. Fad. 12-step recovery programs require members to make a searching and fearless moral inventory, and then to admit the exact nature of our wrongs to another human being, a structure that maps almost exactly onto the examination of conscience and verbal confession at the heart of the sacrament, developed independently decades later by people addressing addiction rather than sin. Modern trauma-informed therapy increasingly emphasizes the importance of verbalizing shame to a trusted listener rather than allowing it to remain private and unspoken, because unspoken shame has been repeatedly shown across independent psychological research to compound rather than resolve over time. Restorative justice programs used in some modern criminal justice systems as an alternative or supplement to purely punitive approaches deliberately bring offenders face to face with the people they harmed, specifically because naming the harm out loud to the people affected produces outcomes that private guilt alone does not. None of these modern parallels are religious. All of them arrived independently at a similar underlying insight. Something changes when wrongdoing is spoken aloud, specifically to another person, under conditions where that disclosure will not be weaponized against you later. What confession adds within Catholic theological claims is the piece none of those secular structures can offer on their own. A declaration of the matter being conclusively finished, not processed, not managed, not on the road to healing, but formally actually completely absolved. 12-step programs, by design, treat recovery as lifelong and never fully finished. Therapy, done well, offers insight and coping tools, but a therapist does not claim authority to declare your guilt